Reading 70 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Burlip, April 14th, 1945. The work idea of yes and no. There are many things in the work that we have heard but do not yet understand. Some people think that when they have heard a thing, they know it and understand it, confusing knowing and understanding. And when they hear it again, they tend not to listen or become impatient. They say, "Oh yes, we've heard that before. We have heard over and over again that we have to observe ourselves. We have heard that we have to remember ourselves. We know all that." So when they hear these words, these phrases, they become bored and pay no attention to what is being said. It is like being told that if you want to ride a bicycle, you must balance yourself on it. You may hear this repeated often enough, but do you imagine you understand how to ride a bicycle just by hearing and knowing that you have to balance yourself on it? Just in the same way, to observe oneself in terms of what the work teaches takes long personal work and practice. And to realize by practice what to remember oneself means takes far longer. Simply to know lies in the external memory, but to be able to practice and understand what you know is quite a different thing. So to begin to understand what self-observation is and why it is necessary is quite a different thing from just hearing and knowing that one should observe oneself. Today I'm going to speak of something the work teaches that many of you have heard before, that many of you know in your memory, but probably only in your memory. Remember that what you have only in your memory is not yet a part of yourself, of your being. You may know a lot in your memory, but it is quite external to what you are. It is merely like a notebook with written words, not living. Let us take the work idea of yes and no and recall what is said about this. The work says that formatory center, the mechanical part of intellectual center, which we ordinarily use and call thinking, can only work in terms of yes or no. Through constantly using this lowest part of the thinking center, everything is divided into yes or no. You know how people argue from yes or no. One man says a thing is so and so, and another man says it is not so. One man says a thing is true, and another man says it is not true, and so on. All the world is divided like this. You have only to listen to most forms of ordinary conversation to realize that it is based on this division of yes or no. The work says that in higher centers, this contradiction of yes or no does not exist because in the consciousness belonging to higher centers, there are no contradictions. There is no yes or no, but there is a union of the two, which the work calls yes and no. Obviously, our ordinary thought and language utterly fail here. They cannot comprehend or describe that state of consciousness and understanding that belongs to higher centers. But if we cannot grasp this, you will agree with me that our ordinary language is based on a sharp division of yes or no. And our ordinary thinking is similar. This means that we always exclude one side of a problem in favor of the other side. So we have to take sides all the time and are regarded as weak if we do not. So we divide ourselves into opposite camps as the whole world does, and we continually hypnotize ourselves by saying that a thing surely must either be true or not true, or that a person is either good or bad, and so on. All this is the work of the formatory part of the intellectual center, which can only think by means of opposites, that is, by comparison, and has no idea how to draw the opposites together and find a third solution, which is neither yes nor no, but yes and no. The whole thing lies in this third solution. It is sometimes said that this work is imitating the work of higher centers. Now, since all opposites are united in a harmony in higher centers, and there are no contradictions, it is clear that thinking only by the aid of that lowest instrument of thought, the formatory center, will certainly not be imitating higher centers. What is this third solution? It is not composed of either yes or no, but of some combination of yes and no. We are told that this yes and no is the language of higher centers, and this must mean in some way that yes and no are united into a third thing, a third solution unknown to us, which is neither yes nor no, but some harmony or union of two opposites, so that each opposite vanishes or loses its identity, and a new thing appears that we cannot comprehend. Let us call this third thing X. Then yes plus no equals X. Our ordinary solutions to problems are yes or no. We do not know X. I sometimes think that Sly Man knows this X and how it is rightly reached. But we can be sure that if ever by accident we stumble on this third solution to some problem, we will probably get a sudden force from higher centers which deal only in X, no doubt much to our surprise. But if we solve our problem only by either a heavy yes or a heavy no, no doubt we will not get any help, not being clever enough. You remember how often in the Gospels the clever person is mentioned, the 5 clever virgins, the clever man who built his house on a rock, and so on, the word being so badly translated as wise. Yes, I am sure there are clever and right solutions to things which escape our heavy, one-footed formatory thinking. And since the Gospels have been mentioned, think only of the parables. Are they in terms of yes or no? Are they not in another language? In fact, in the language of higher emotional center? However, people get impatient with them and say, why cannot they say exactly what they mean in plain, sensible, downright language that is either yes or no? But are we sure that what we call plain, sensible, downright language is either so plain or so sensible as we suppose? Does it express all sides, or full meaning, or full truth, or is it one-sided, and inevitably so? In any case, we can grasp that the language and ways of thought and connections of ideas in higher centers are quite different from our ordinary forms of speech and associations, and infinitely more comprehensive and inclusive. We make a dogmatic yes or a dogmatic no, but experience shows us that this one-sided solution is always useless, always wrong. We have therefore to be far more careful or more clever in leading ourselves out of some inner or outer problem. It is not a flat denial or a flat affirmation that will help us, because we will miss all the many intermediate stages lying between these two violent extremes, all these inner octaves of finer meaning that we seek to become more conscious of in our daily life, all these sources of new meaning. I was going to say new and undreamed of meaning, but I fancy that often these finer meanings, finer solutions, are just what we do dream of without realizing it, not understanding the marvelous language which is so similar to that of parables. There's always so much meaning passing through us that we do not realize. The reason is that the activities of the higher centers are continually passing through us, only we cannot hear, cannot contact them, not having a fine enough receptive side. The emotional center, purified of negative emotions, begins to hear them. But when we are identified in negative, it cannot. So that is a good reason to work against states of negativeness and identification. By the way, just think of the solutions you make to problems when you are negative. There's nothing very clever about them, is there? Or again, when you are violently enthusiastic. In both cases, you try to solve things through one or the other opposite, through no or yes, in accordance with how the pendulum swings from side to side. I am sure myself that such solutions are valueless, and in fact are not solutions at all. But we all have many eyes that think they are, and these eyes tempt us to make impossible violent decisions that we cannot keep, and by which we only torture ourselves. No, it is only when the pendulum is just one side or the other of the middle point that we can see where solutions may lie, and not when the pendulum has swung to its full extent in one direction or the other. The truth is that we are not usually conscious, save in the extremes of the pendulum where we identify most. But by self-observation, we become slowly more conscious in the middle region of the pendulum swing, and here something can be done. Here we have, as it were, to create a conscious pendulum, restricted in its movement, that swings a little one way and then a little the other way, and this by an effort of mind, by a pressure of will. This restriction is possible only when you no longer for one moment believe in the extreme violent swings of the mechanical pendulum. That is, when you absolutely reject all violent and excited decisions of any kind. One must not listen to the eyes at either extreme of the pendulum. This we probably can all agree to from our own personal work on ourselves. But what does this to and fro movement of the restricted pendulum mean? It has to do with yes and no. Now suppose you are entirely unconscious of your reactions. That is, that you have absolutely no power of self-observation and are quite asleep. Then you will say yes to all moods and all impressions. You will equally say yes to an impression of dislike or of like. You are then doing no personal work because you are asleep. You are precisely a machine, as the work teaches. There is then no question of yes or no. And certainly there is no question of the more difficult yes and no. The subject can have no interest for you. Now suppose I am working on myself and I notice an impression of dislike. I see someone and mechanically react by dislike. Let us take this from yes or no. I can say yes to the mechanical reaction that this impression of this person makes in me, in which case I will probably think how I dislike him after I no longer see him as an external object. Now suppose I do not care for this inner state and wish to do something about it. I then can say no to the impression, that is, to its effect on me. Then, when I see the person, I say no to the mechanical reaction in me that the sight of him causes, and also I say no to any negative thoughts that come when I do not actually see him. This may work very well in some cases. It may be enough. The matter dies away. On the other hand, I may find myself still bothered with negative thoughts in spite of this no that I have said to myself. I then try to think generously of that person, to try to appreciate him, to be kind, and so on, and so get rid of opposite ideas and feelings. This may work a short time. Then I find that I am still bothered with him and seem unable to adjust myself. Now what have I been doing so far? I have been practicing the method, as it were, of yes or no. That is, I am trying to solve the problem by identifying with one or with the other of the opposites. I am not trying to bring them together. That is, to practice yes and no. I have been trying to get a one-sided solution, or a solution on one side or the other. I have not mixed the black with the white and made a pattern of both, but have tried black and then white separately. I cannot explain this any further. It is very difficult to put into words. I can only say that if you can manage to use the second method, yes and no, you will get results that you cannot get with the method of yes or no. In the method of yes and no, you go so far in thought and feeling in one direction, and so far in the opposite, just so far. I mean, a short way only. This is like the to and fro movement of a restricted pendulum. A mixture or mingling results. This is quite different from mechanically swinging from like of a person one day to dislike of him the next. That leads to no mingling. The opposites are not brought together consciously. But in the yes and no method, the opposite aspects are brought together by a conscious act of the will. Of course, imaginary I and false personality, which must always be right and can never be wrong, come into all this. However, when we observe ourselves in the right way and begin to include the other side, the unrecognized side, the side in darkness, we then change our feeling of ourselves and begin to know for a fact that we are both yes and no in regard to everything. You often see people who are strongly based on yes in regard to themselves and have no conception of no, that is, of an opposite contradictory side existing in them. They always tell the truth. They always do right and are right. They always know exactly what they are doing. In short, there is nothing wrong with them that matters. These are indeed yes men to themselves, and they are indeed dead in themselves and to themselves. They cannot grow internally. They are dead in the work sense. When we are like that, we live in a very strange artificial relationship to ourselves, which the work never ceases to try to break down. It never ceases to try to break down this inner situation, because unless it is broken down, the person cannot become a real person, but remains a purely invented, imaginary person, and it may be quite true in many cases that this is just as well. But for a person who is not quite so sure of himself, who does not accept all his opinions and valuations without some doubt, who does not take himself for granted, there is a possibility of inner change. If he works, he will gradually be shown at the right time by the action of the work itself on him, where the no side comes in, where he is not what he imagined and said yes to. This all belongs to the lessening of the power of the personality, which until then has always been active and dominating. Unless the personality becomes gradually passive, there can be no growth of the essential side of a man. For the first stages of life, personality must be built up strongly. But for the second stage, the esoteric stage, this second education that esotericism seeks to give us, the personality must become more and more passive, and all the values we have attached to the personality must undergo change. We can no longer be like what we were. This is not extraordinary if you think what this work is about, namely inner change, and how the method of self-observation, of new self-knowledge, is designed to change a man. If you wish to change, you cannot remain the same, because change means something different. Once Mr. Ouspensky said, "It would be very good for some of you to deliberately argue against what you hold to be right and true and good." He said, "Try to take the opposite standpoint deliberately at times and see what happens to you." He added that sometimes the result was to make you doubt your own opinions, your own yes, and realize there are other points of view to which you cannot say no. And I remember once at a meeting that he assumed the position of a man who was going to argue about everything that was said in the work and maintain it was not true. And I can assure you that many people were much startled and surprised. That is, people who had never really thought for themselves about the ideas of the work, but had simply religiously written them down in the notebooks of their memory without questioning. The effect on those who had struggled from their own thinking was different. Why? Because they had let in the no side and had come to some decision as a result, and so could not be so easily shaken by doubts and contrary arguments, but had found their own point of view for the time being. Now, in the fourth way, we are none of us protected lambs, spoon-fed children, and we have to undergo all the temptations of yes or no individually in connection with esoteric teaching and all the ideas behind it. Otherwise, we have no real point in the work, as it is called, and then we are like those people mentioned in that marvelous parable called The Sower and the Seed, which speaks of the sowing of esoteric ideas on humanity, where it is said that those who hear the ideas a little but have no root wither away when the sun gets up. Supposing I walk into a meeting and say, "I don't believe this work. It is all nonsense." What would some of you think? And suppose I spent, as O did, some time in bringing all sorts of negative views to bear on the work teaching, and did my best to undermine the whole thing. How would some of you react? You know it is sometimes said in the work that you have to reach the stage in which you can be turned and twisted in every direction, and yet you always eventually right yourself and point in the direction of the work. Do you think this is possible unless you have met the no side of yourself individually? One thing I am sure of, if you have simply said yes to the work without thinking about it, You will be overwhelmed by such a manifestation of no as I have indicated. Now let us speak again about how we have to practice yes and no in place of yes or no. I have compared the practice of yes and no with a kind of to and fro movement or friction. One movement corresponding to yes and the opposite movement to no. You can imagine a movement of your hands going one way and then the opposite way. I told you in the example I gave that it was difficult to understand what this to and fro movement might mean, and I said it could only be done consciously and with a kind of controlled, restricted movement, so that one only goes so far in one direction and so far in the opposite direction. This means that you cannot just feel and think mechanically about a person important for you, a situation important for you in the work sense. You have to control the mechanical movements of the pendulum and restrict them. This is quite different, as I said, from letting yourself go mechanically in a full swing of liking and disliking, loving and hating, or, let us add, elation and despair, enthusiasm and dejection, overestimation and underestimation, disappointment and eager expectancy. You know how people who live in these mechanical swings are easily dashed or easily elevated, and so, as it were, have no middle part. It is very important to create a middle part, which is neither one extreme nor the other, and it is in fact only from this middle part that one can grow. Otherwise, the opposites eat each other up, as it were, or cancel one another out. All that is strong and permanent in us must be wrestled from the power of these extreme swings. All that is strong and permanent in us must be wrested from the power of these extreme swings, protected from them. Emotional people particularly have this difficulty unless they use their other centers and become more balanced. We understand from the work that our first aim is to become balanced. Number 4, man. But this means for more than we can grasp. This means far more than we can grasp at present, and it means a proper and harmonious development of all centers. Sometimes instinctive types or moving types imagine they are extremely well balanced and cannot understand the swings of the emotional type. But this balance that they flatter themselves about is no real balance. It is simply insensitiveness, a complete self-centeredness, a pure selfishness or grossness of being, a lack of understanding which cannot be commended and has nothing to do with the conception of the all-sided balanced man in the work. For when a person lacks all capacity to think or feel, he is just like an animal, and is certainly not a balanced person, but merely an ox or a cow. However, where such a person's appetites and comforts are concerned, we may find considerable swings of the pendulum. Now let me repeat that in this practice of yes and no, in this conscious restriction of oneself to the middle part of the pendulum, having said yes, you must go a little into no, again, until from this to and fro movement a solution is reached that is neither yes nor no. You neither admit nor deny to yourself. This movement must become quicker and quicker until something emerges which is neither yes nor no, but is actually yes and no. This is the third solution. If you can do this, you will find an extraordinary result, namely that you catch a glimpse of the person objectively, as if the person were reflected in a mirror in you, undistorted by your subjective attitudes. The scene then changes, and perhaps for a long time you are undisturbed by the person. You are free from the person, and not only that, but the person is free from you. Then perhaps later the whole thing will start again, and you have once more to do work of this kind if you can. Now, unless you have already been able to see opposites and contradictory sides in yourself, you will find this yes or no friction impossible to understand. I say this because you have to do it also to yourself and see this dark opposite side of you that you are unconscious of. It is easy to take a negative view of yourself at times. At least it should be, if you have had any power of observing yourself. But to rest on such a feeling is wrong. Negative eyes directed toward yourself will then get hold of you. When we have reached the stage of being able to be negative towards ourselves and feel we are no good and so on, we have opened to us only unpleasant memories of ourselves. You all know that our memories are divided into two groups, pleasant and unpleasant. For example, when you are negative towards a person, you can only remember the unpleasant things about that person, and vice versa. It is the same with ourselves. To give way to negative thoughts about oneself is useless if we go too far into them. So we have to draw back from them by an opposite movement and in some way say yes to ourselves. And this struggle between yes and no in regard to one's relationship to oneself is, in my experience, as important as the same struggle with regard to other people. It is neither in yes nor in no that the truth lies, but in that combination called yes and no. Now this makes a mingling of dark and bright in us, a pattern of two opposites, a synthesis. As a result of this, we are immensely broadened and strengthened both towards ourselves and other people. Although, as I said in a previous paper, it may seem to us as though we were losing our very identity, our very sense of ourselves. But this is exactly what we have to lose in order to change. All our values have to change, particularly some quite absurd values that we cling to in regard to our own integrity and self-estimation. For example, most of you are people who often lie, whatever your imaginary idea of yourself is. Nor are any of you people who always lie. If you are going to put the question, am I a liar, yes or no, you will get nowhere. The actual situation is yes and no. It is both. In this respect, you are not pure white nor pure black, but black and white. It is this stage that we have to reach and acknowledge, first of all, this mingling which comes through direct self-observation and self-knowledge. From this mingling, quite new things may start, far beyond us at present, in regard to inner development. But we have to reach a basis of this kind to begin with, because this releases us from the personality and shifts the center of gravity of consciousness inwards towards that which can grow in us. This is the meaning of many phrases in esoteric literature to the effect that a man must lose himself, lose his attributes, lose all he has ascribed to himself, and it is what the work calls making the personality passive. Now I will speak from a different angle about this subject. When you are in a state of real self-observation, you can see different eyes trying to take hold of you. You want to sit down, you want to rest, you want to eat, you want to smoke, you want to listen to some negative eyes, you want to feel depressed, you want to feel bored, you want to feel wronged, you want to find fault, you want to hurt somebody, you want to get into a temper. You hear all these different eyes speaking all around you, and probably many others, and you say no to them all. All these eyes wish you to say yes to them, to consent to what they suggest. Now, to what do you have to say no? You have to say no to yourself and not to the others. And this is self-remembering. You do not say no to the eyes, but you say no to yourself. G used to say, in self-remembering, which self do you wish to remember? I do not suppose anyone will understand what I mean here, but at the same time, it may explain something that you may have experienced. In this state of agreement between I and myself, a state is reached in which no eyes can touch you for the time being, and although they wish you to say yes, and as it were, beckon, I and myself have agreed together to say no. Not to each eye individually, for that would simply lead to argument with them, which is nearly always fatal. But this agreement is rather a silence in which I and myself decide to say no to ourselves, as if we could not be disturbed by any eyes surrounding us, as if we were going to occupy ourselves with something quite different, as if I and myself were in some conversation with one another that none of these surrounding eyes had any power over. This is the best description that I can give you at present of self-remembering, this agreement between I and myself. Let us not waste time asking what exactly I means there, or what myself means, but only recall that self-remembering means remembering and so contacting some self in us that lifts us above the power of the crowd of eyes. Of course, the state I describe is transitory, but it is a quite different experience. Nor must you expect that if you ever touch it, everything is going to be quite easy afterwards. Remember that learning this work, understanding it, and doing it is a task that lasts our whole lifetime. Now I will only give you one hint of what I and myself means. There is something in us called the soul, about which the work rarely speaks, but which it acknowledges. The work says that the soul is a very small thing in us at present, and is merely a point of intensity. The work says that where we are most identified is where this point of intensity goes into some desire, some I. The work also says that this small thing called the soul must get much bigger, and that this is only possible through not identifying with oneself and not always going with one's self-will. So perhaps you will see from this hint how it comes about that if I and myself are in agreement, no surrounding eyes in me have any power. Now, will you please discuss first of all this idea of yes and no, this restricted movement, consciously controlled between what we usually take as our good and bad states, our good and bad sides.